Now that we have introduced these two mechanisms, let's dive deeper into the X509 mTLS approach. Before we begin with this flow, I want to highlight the importance of the earlier lessons on X509 mTLS in the chapter on the client authentication methods. If you haven't watched those lessons yet, make sure to review them first, as this lesson builds upon those foundational concepts. The first requirement for this mechanism is that the client authenticates itself using the X509 mTLS method. As always, we begin with the OAuth 2 rules for the client credentials flow: the OAuth 2 client, the authorization server, and the resource server. Each of these entities has its own key store and trust store. If you recall from the basics, a key store holds the public and private keys of the certificate and includes the entire certificate chain if applicable. Each server has its own key pair. A trust store, on the other hand, contains trusted root certificate authorities, which are used to validate the signatures of incoming certificates. The flow begins when the client wants to obtain an access token. To do this, the client authenticates itself using the X509 mTLS method, as discussed in the X509 mTLS lesson. This flow starts on the TLS layer, where the TLS protocol is performed. During the TLS handshake, the client and the authorization server exchange their certificates. At the conclusion of this handshake, the authorization server has confirmed that the client possesses the private key corresponding to the public key in its certificate, without ever exposing the private key. This is the strength of the X509 mTLS mechanism. Next, we move to the application layer, where the POST request to obtain an access token is executed. If everything went smoothly at the TLS layer, the authorization server is now ready to generate an access token. Up to this point, everything aligns with what we have already covered in the X509 mTLS lesson as a client authentication method. The difference here is an extension of the flow, the feature of binding an access token to the client certificate. To achieve this, the authorization server calculates a thumbprint, a hash of the client certificate, and includes it in the access token within the CNF confirmation claim. Here's an example of a JWT access token with an additional CNF claim that contains the client's thumbprint. If we are not using a JWT access token, but instead an opaque token, this mechanism still works. In such cases, the CNF information is stored on the authorization server. Assuming we are using a JWT access token, the authorization server then returns the token, which now includes the CNF claim, to the client. Next, the client attempts to access resources on the resource server. To do this, it doesn't just present the access token, it also authenticates itself to the resource server using the X509 mTLS method, just as we have seen before. This involves performing the TLS handshake and exchanging certificates. At this stage, the resource server confirms that the client possesses the private key corresponding to the public key in its certificate, again without exposing the private key. Now we proceed to the application layer. The client sends a request to the resource server to obtain resources. As usual, the request includes the access token in the authorization header, but now it also includes the additional CNF claim. The resource server then validates the access token as usual. However, in this case, it also verifies the CNF claim within the token by calculating the thumbprint of the client certificate presented during the TLS handshake. It then compares this calculated thumbprint with the one included in the CNF claim of the access token. If these values match, it confirms that the token is bound to the client presenting the certificate. If they don't match, the token is rejected. This ensures that the token is bound to the client that possesses the corresponding private key. Note that if an opaque token is presented here, the CNF can still be verified by querying the authorization server, which stores this information. The specific implementation details for this process depend on the OAuth 2 authorization server you are using. Now let's wrap up with the scenario where an attacker intercepts and steals the access token from the client. At this point, the access token is already bound to the client certificate through the CNF claim included in the token. The attacker, having intercepted the token along with the CNF claim, attempts to use it to access resources on the resource server. To do so, the attacker must authenticate using mTLS. The attacker has their own key store and trust store, but the key pair is certainly not the same as the client's key pair. The attacker sends a request to the resource server. Once again, the process begins at the TLS layer where the TLS protocol is performed. During the TLS handshake, the attacker masquerading as the client and the resource server exchange certificates. At the conclusion of this handy check, the resource server confirms that the presented certificate is valid and that the requester possesses the private key corresponding to the public key in the certificate without exposing the private key itself. However, if the certificate authority that issued the attacker's certificate is not trusted by the resource server, the request will be immediately rejected as unauthorized. Now, let's assume the attacker's certificate is from a trusted certificate authority and passes the TLS layer validation. The resource server then proceeds to validate the access token and verify the CNF claim. This is where the issue arises for the attacker. The CNF claim in the token doesn't match the attacker's certificate because it's bound to the client certificate. This mismatch results in the resource server rejecting the request as unauthorized, effectively preventing the attacker from using the stolen token.